You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kleiman.
On today's podcast, we welcome back Anne Jaclard to talk about the recent Dobbs Supreme Court decision taking away the right to an abortion in the United States. We're going to talk about the political fallout from the decision and some of the history of the women's movement in this country around reproductive issues. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, to read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. You can also make a donation to the podcast there on the website. While our podcast is hosted by MHI, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of MHI. In just a moment, we'll be talking with Anne Jaclard about the Dobbs decision. But first, as we do in every episode, Andrew and I are going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events. Today is Tuesday, August 23rd. We're going to be talking about the ongoing investigations into Trump. It's been a couple weeks since the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago. And we also are going to be talking about the political fallout from that. In particular, there was a piece in Slate on August 19th by Dahlia Lithwick entitled, "We Don't Need a Trump-Inspired Civil War for Things to Get Real Bad, Real Fast." And it's a quick discussion of how things might play out from here with the Trump base, whether they're going to be encouraged to be more violent or whether some of this stuff might actually wither away as Trump faces more consequences.
And, it could be both at the same time. In other words, the violent ones get more and more violent, but they have a smaller, circle of people around them, and other people they might still sympathize, but they give up and they move on.
Right. I mean, that's part of what the piece is trying to suss out, because some people are saying that the escalation of rhetoric against the FBI and the Justice Department sort of laying the ground for some real violent confrontation, while other people are maybe suggesting that as Trump is diminished by these prosecutions, that it will have a negative effect on the potency of the Trump base. The infighting and the backstabbing is going to take the wind out of the sails of the Trump base.
Yeah, I mean, the way Dahlia Lithwick puts it, and she's referring to what Juliette Kayyem says, the more Trump looks like a loser, the more his followers begin to turn on one another. So, I mean, we've said this for a very, very long time, that the way you're going to reach Trump voters is to defeat Trump and Trumpism, not the other way. You're not going to reach them first and then defeat Trumpism. So I think that's the key question here is, does Trump still have his magical superpowers that are going to enable him to miraculously get out of this the way he seems to have miraculously gotten out of everything before? Or is he going to go down? And if he goes down, well, then what happens? We're going to see a major civil war, fascist uprising from the base, or is it going to be that the real violent wing is still going to be there, but diminished in strength, and the other people will slink away and begin to turn on one another? Yeah. She
points to some ways in which the Republicans are turning on themselves already that might point toward this thesis that Trumpism will be diminished by these prosecutions. She, mentions that Mike Pence came out and defended the FBI recently, that some influential people are endorsing Ron DeSantis and separating themselves from Trump.
Right. The influential person that's mentioned, however, has just walked that back.
Oh, is that right? Do you mean Alex Jones?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I didn't read the story because that's how much I care about him and his followers, but he was evidently on TV begging for forgiveness.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, she mentions Alex Jones, who apparently came out and criticized Trump over Trump's endorsement of vaccines and said, Ron DeSantis is the real deal. He's better than Trump, but apparently he's walked that back. She also, I think, mentions Elon Musk endorsing DeSantis over Trump. It's a crazy day that these are the gatekeepers of the Republican sentiment. But she also points to some Fox News people, right, that
Yeah, Laura Ingraham is really beside herself. She does not know what to do. She thinks that Trump is going to go down very clearly, and she's trying to like dig out of this hole, and she doesn't want to be caught when the whole thing comes crashing down.
Yeah, there are these people who are sort of trying to walk the tightrope and not get rolled over by the Trump base. No, you're not. They don't want the mob at their door, but they also want to create some distance to save their own skin. Right? If he gets the electric chair for treason or whatever, they want to have some distance. But then there's also like the sharks that are circling. They smell blood, right? That's like Ron DeSantis, these other people who want to be Trump 2.0, and they're just like waiting for their chance to swoop in.
There is that aspect of if Trump personally goes down, can Trumpism just keep chugging along as a political movement with the same strength as before under, new leadership? Or will a lot of the base go the other way because it's a cult of personality, and DeSantis and personality don't mix?
That's the hard thing about a cult of personality. It's hard to
cult of no personality.
Yeah.
Beyond that, there's the Republican establishment, and a good deal of what Dahlia Lithwick says is like the Republican establishment really wants Trump gone, but the irony, so to speak, is that they are doing everything they can to whip up, the conspiracy thinking, the faux outrage over the, Mar-a-Lago raid and all that kind of thing. And it's because they have no political downside. They don't suffer any consequences. It's the rest of us who suffer consequences. Luckily, we haven't seen many consequences thus far. Just some wacko with a nail gun storming the FBI, trying to blast through the bulletproof glass. There hasn't been much thus far. But I really think the issue is this. We've talked about this before. Going back to Access Hollywood, going back to the Judge Curiel, going back everything. It was always like, okay, Trump can't get out of it this time. He's going to go down. And we've seen again and again worse and worse things, and he doesn't go down. I believe that this time is different. It's because his usual bag of tricks are to do something to show that he's got a lot of people behind him, and it really matters, and that they can spin the facts their way, they can do their alternative facts, they can create their version, and then it's always one narrative versus another narrative, and you just hate Trump and everything, and this is a witch hunt, and so forth. All of that has been true of everything that Trump has been involved in before. It cannot work this time.
When you say this time, you're referring to the classified documents.
The Mar-a-Lago scandal, all aspects of it.
Okay.
Also, the Georgia probe. There are laws on the books, and there are, it looks like, enough judges who are going to go by the book and by the facts, and juries as well. And when you look at Trump's record in these kinds of things, it's always very poor. I mean, how many of those decisions did he win when he was trying to overturn the election of 2020 in the courts? I mean, there were, 63 cases. He lost 62. One, which was a minor technical point, he prevailed on a minor technical point. He doesn't do well. He did not do well with the Trump University case way back. Again and again, what he talks about gets laughed out of court. I mean, it's court related. This one's not criminal, but not long ago, a week ago, he had to testify, and he pleaded the Fifth Amendment 440 times. So he's got magical superpowers when it comes to fascist demagogy. He doesn't have magical superpowers when it comes to evading the consequences of the law, as long as people in charge of the law are going to, go by it. And I have every indication, it looks like Merrick Garland, when he says no one's above the law and blah, 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 that indicates that he is not going to flinch in the end on these matters, whether he wants to go after Trump or not. I find it hard to imagine he's going to say, well, we got this guy dead to rights. He's guilty as sin, but for the good of the country, let bygones be bygones. I just, at this point, things gotten to be too big. I just can't imagine him doing that.
Well, we will see. We're going to have to leave it at that. Up next, our conversation with Anne Jaclard about the Dobbs decision.
Today, we're going to be speaking with Anne Jaclard, who's the organizational secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. She's been a Marxist-Humanist and a feminist activist since the 1960s. She demonstrated for legalizing abortion prior to the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973, and she continued supporting abortion rights throughout the nearly 50 years since the Roe decision. And we're going to be discussing today the recent Supreme Court Dobbs decision, which took away the federal right to abortion that Roe established, and talk about how Dobbs came about and its aftermath thus far.
So welcome, Anne Jaclard, back to the podcast.
Thanks, you guys. It's good to be with you.
So the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization was issued about 2 months ago, and suddenly, as most of us on the planet are aware now, a woman's right to choose whether to continue a pregnancy has no federal legal protection anymore in the United States. All abortion rights have become threatened. But for listeners who maybe are outside of the U.S. and aren't totally tuned into what's going on in the U.S., can you briefly catch everyone up to speed on what the Dobbs decision means?
Sure, but I bet our foreign listeners have a good idea because women's struggles for the right to abortion have been going on all over the world in recent years, from Ireland to Argentina and beyond. In the U.S., we thought we'd won the fight almost 50 years ago when the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade held that abortion decisions with some restrictions are up to women and their doctors, so that state laws criminalizing abortion were all suddenly invalid. Now with Dobbs reversing Roe v. Wade, there's no federal legal protection for abortion rights. About half the states have already effectively outlawed abortion or are poised to do so. And the Trump Republican Party wants Congress to outlaw abortion nationally. The details of the ruling are shocking, most notably that it makes no exception to its advocacy of an absolute ban on abortion. In all the years that abortion rights were chipped away at over the past 50 years, and many state restrictions were upheld, there was always some exception written into permissible bans. Usually the exceptions were for victims of rape and incest or when a woman's life or health was in danger. Now, because Dobbs speaks in such absolutist terms against abortion, Trump Republican states are passing laws with no exceptions at all, resulting in horrible situations such as forcing children who've been raped to bear children and forcing women to carry dead fetuses to term. The difficulties of obtaining an abortion where they remain legal at all are adding to poor women's burdens. Abortion care providers where they remain at work are hobbled and threatened with prosecution by insane restrictions, such as laws allowing abortion only during the first 6 weeks of pregnancy, a time when most women don't even know they're pregnant. In addition to this, Hobbes hints that other rights expanded by the courts over the past few decades, even the right to contraception and to marry outside your, quote, race, close quote, these could also be lost. Undoubtedly, more and more laws against racial discrimination, those protecting voting rights and privacy rights, and regulating industry, many will be struck down by this court. That's for sure.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot to talk about just in terms of what it means for abortion to be illegal in so much of the United States. But then there's also the precedents set by Dobbs for how the Supreme Court understands rights in general and how you defend or make a case for a right in U.S. law, and all the precedents that sets for lots of different things, from gay marriage to interracial marriage to all sorts of issues. With the abortion issue, you brought up, Anne, this issue of these very restrictive laws where there are no exceptions even for rape, incest, life of the mother, etc. I mean, even in places where people are talking about such exceptions, like I feel like the exceptions thing is kind of this hand wave, kind of get out of jail free card, where politicians make themselves like not responsible for all the effects of their such restrictions. Like these are like sometimes, especially when it comes to like the health of the mother, these are like very nuanced, complicated medical decisions that you can't really address in a state legislature. There really are medical decisions for a doctor and a patient to work out. And there's this chilling effect now where doctors are afraid to make those kind of nuanced decisions because the laws are so black and white and written by people who are ignorant of, maybe even willfully ignorant of these medical nuances. And doctors are just afraid to do a lot of things that they maybe could get away with, maybe couldn't get away with under certain state laws because the law is so oblivious to the nuance of women's health care.
For instance, doctors who know that they need to treat a woman to perform an emergency abortion, and they can't do it, even though the woman's life is in danger because she's not bleeding enough yet. So they have to wait for her to be really bleeding heavily till they feel that they're safe under the law.
Right. Or the fetus is going to die, but it's not dead yet. It has a heartbeat, and there's a fetal heartbeat law. But you know that the baby's going to die as soon as it's born or something, and that the mother could die giving birth to the baby. But OB-GYNs, their hands are tied because of these state laws that are completely oblivious, or like I said, maybe willfully oblivious to these nuances of how women's healthcare works in like the modern era.
This is causing doctors and abortion care providers to leave the field in droves because of the threat of prosecution if they make a wrong call on what's necessary to save the life of a woman. They're increasingly not allowing the health of the mother or the best care of the mother to be a reason for performing an abortion. Mother's life has to be in danger, which has been held to me. She's like bleeding to death, and in 5 minutes she will have bled out if you don't do something. I mean, they're really, really narrow definitions, and they're killing people already.
And then even this like exceptions for rape and incest is such a problematic exception. Problematic in the sense that like what do you have to do to prove you were raped in order to not be prosecuted for having an abortion? And what do you as an OB-GYN have to do to ensure that your patient has proven that they were the victim of incest or rape before you give them abortion? I mean, it's like the amount of steps, hurdles that one might have to jump through is daunting, as you can imagine. Especially in the case of incest, a lot of people, the victims, don't have the ability to find legal redress before they would get an abortion. So it's just like, it's like politicians kind of trying to wash their hands of the dirty details of these laws.
Well, I don't think they are. I think the right-wingers who are running most of the Republican-controlled states are relishing this. They think it's what their base wants. They're trying to be Trumpier than Trump. And to hell with women. They don't care what it sounds like.
Well, that's why it's interesting that the language is changing now, where they don't even want to like deal with these exceptions anymore, right? Now the language is like, what do you call it?
Well, I call it absolutist. In other words, no abortions ever. Basically, maybe if the mother's on the threshold of death, but otherwise not. But can we talk about what women are doing here and not just their victimization?
Sure, yeah. So, what do you see that's going on right now in response to the Dobbs ruling?
Well, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women are mobilizing. There were huge demonstrations right after the decision. Unfortunately, it was too little and too late to stop it. But now there's enormous activity in the women's movement, trying to protect the right where it still exists, raising money all over the country to send poor women out of a state where abortion's now effectively illegal to receive care in other states, helping women get telemedicine appointments to receive the abortion pill in the mail and trying to block new attempts to outlaw abortion, which are going on in every state and nationally, Congress. But giddy with their success in the courts, the right-wingers' assaults on women's rights have intensified. Some states are now outlawing the abortion pill, a normally safe alternative to abortion if taken early. States are even claiming they can outlaw your receiving the pills in the mail, as if they could control the mail. This morning I got an email from Amnesty International that says, quote, reports are surfacing that Facebook and Instagram are removing posts with information about how to access abortion pills, and even temporarily banning people who post about abortion pills. This is incredibly dangerous for people seeking information about safe abortion, close quote. So the red states are moving with lightning speed, or at least the Trumpian ones. They're trying to change their constitutions to permanently ban abortion, but the public is not accepting these moves. Other states are amending their constitutions to guarantee the right to abortion. And the polls, if you're following them, show enormous support for the right to abortion. The most dramatic thing that happened was in thoroughly red Kansas on August 2, when the anti-abortionists had put a proposal on the ballot to permit the state legislature to change the Constitution so that they could outlaw abortion in the Constitution, in other words, permanently for Kansas. But to everyone's surprise, even though that state went for Trump by something like 20 points, the proposition was defeated by 20 points. The support for abortion not only has been for some time very high, way over majority, something like 70%. It's now gone up because people are shaken up by what happened in Dobbs, and they see the handwriting on the wall for all abortion rights. So they're fighting like hell in all kinds of different ways, and it's put the Republican Trumpites in big trouble in current and future elections.
How many states give people the ability to put questions like abortion to the voters by means of referenda? I would assume that the Republican states are scurrying to make it impossible to put something like that on referendum right now, because if you can by referendum keep abortion legal in Kansas, you can probably keep it legal by referendum anywhere in the country, maybe with the exception of Alabama and Mississippi.
I don't know the answer to your question. Most states have some procedure for putting anything on a referendum that gets enough signatures and petitions. But I don't think that's the main point of contention. In other words, if you can defeat a referendum proposal like that, you should also be able to turn the Republican legislators and governor who want to do that, you should be able to turn them out of office. So there's a lot of emphasis now on registering and voting and preserving voting rights where they're being taken away, so that we don't continue in a position where half the states have legislatures that hate women and want to ban them from having lives.
Anne, were you surprised by the Dobbs decision?
No, not at all. First of all, it was leaked in April, but it was clear at the oral argument last December that the Trump Republican court was going to take away women's autonomy over our own bodies. And it was clear much earlier that Roe would be lost after Trump got to pick 3 members of the Supreme Court. His nominees were questioned at their ratification hearings about whether they had an agenda to eliminate Roe, and they all just lied and said no, they were open-minded, they believed in precedent, they believed in was established law, they all said that. But everyone knew or should have known what would happen, because Trump had promised his Christian fundamentalist base that he would get rid of Roe. and he was busily appointing right-wing anti-abortionist judges to the lower federal courts. But a deeper reason for knowing this would happen was the misogynist and anti-human rhetoric and practices of most Trump appointees and policies in every field of government, whether it's defunding health care or ripping babies from immigrant mothers at the border. So this new decision is simply the culmination of 50 years of counter-revolution against Roe.
What I heard from a lot of commentators, abortion rights activists and other people on TV and such, is they weren't surprised either, but they would say, well, I'm not surprised, but I'm still shocked. It comes as a blow to them, even though they fully expected it. Is that your experience as well, Anne?
Yes, and it's a continuing shock. I'm still having trouble getting my head around it. To realize that half the population in the U.S. has suddenly been relegated to second-class citizenship, we've been stripped of our personhood and reduced to breeders without control over our own bodies and lives. I was also shocked by the vicious misogyny of the decision, which talks about fetuses as persons while ignoring the effect of the end of abortion rights on women. So women can no longer live full autonomous lives. And Justice Alito, who wrote the decision, actually sneers at the bare mention of the word woman. And he says nothing about their rights or his decision's impact on them. And he sort of makes fun of the dissenting decision, which was written by the two women still on the court, Ann Byers, who left. And he sort of sneers at them calls their legal arguments silly when his are just made up out of thin air to a large extent.
Maybe we should get into what that rationalization was. For the last 50 years, the Supreme Court had guaranteed this right, and now it's all of a sudden not a constitutional right. So what was the logic behind that for the conservatives on the court?
I think logic is too strong a word to use. You can read the thing, you won't understand it because it's in legalese, but basically what the Alito and the majority did was lie. They lied about the history of abortion laws, saying, oh, it was always illegal. They lied about the history of the constitutional provisions that are the basis for the rights invoked by Roe. They lie about what they mean, what they meant, and they lie about the prior court decisions. So you can't analyze this decision like you would normally analyze a Supreme Court decision, because it's crazy. And once the highest court in the nation has turned its back on even bourgeois law in favor of political agenda, and it's gone rogue like Dobbs is, the court can define our future because there's no higher authority who can stop it, and it's terrifying, frankly.
And they can do it on a case-by-case basis, coming up with whatever rationalization they feel at the moment, split this hair, split that hair. They've thrown out precedent. They've thrown out consistency, it seems. And so basically, they're just going to do whatever they feel like it in furtherance of their own political agenda. They're communicating that pretty clearly, I think. Is that the way you see it?
Yes. Well, they haven't said it except where the decision talks about the 14th Amendment, but it's certainly implied in everything that Alito says and does. Roe relied on the Constitution's provisions in the 14th Amendment. They're for equal protection of the law and due process of law and the intrinsic right to privacy. And these are suddenly meaningless phrases, since, of course, the Constitution doesn't enumerate abortion rights or gay rights or racial equality or anything. So you have to read them in through the 14th Amendment and other provisions. And now you can't. So it's a whole new world, right? I mean, over the last 40 years in particular, the court has found new constitutional rights, people's individual freedoms, such as racial and sexual orientation and stuff. But it's never been done what they did in Dobbs, which is not to find new rights, but to take away 50-year-old rights. So it's not really about law at all. It's about diminishing rights, and it's obviously a trick in service to a political agenda. If I may add this, that the tragedy on top of the tragedy here is that we may well have kissed the rule of law goodbye altogether. Since on the basis of Dobbs, no rules or laws need to be enduring. They can just come and go on the whim of the authoritarian ruler who makes up all the laws he wants or needs. So this makes it all even more terrifying.
They're first of all telling us we don't have any rights other than the rights that are explicitly spelled out in the Constitution, or people, I don't know, 250 years ago understood, according to their interpretation of what people understood 250 years ago, the Constitution to mean. Our rights can't grow, and expand as society develops. But I mean, even beyond that, they ignore, as you said, they ignore a lot of things. They make up things. They lie. They're telling us that we are just garbage, that we have really no rights at all, and that they're going to do to us whatever they can get away with. Which, I mean, one understands that when the ruling class feels that it has to do that, it does that anyway. But it's a real kind of shocker that they're saying this openly, that we don't matter, and they're going to do what the hell they want, despite our opposition, and so much of the country is opposed to them.
The fact that so much of the sentiment of the country is opposed to the Dobbs decision is pretty striking. I mean, the Kansas referendum was striking. I mean, some in the Republican Party have worried about the political backlash to this, as, it seems like the Kansas vote portends a possible backlash. There's discussion about the upcoming midterm elections in the U.S. maybe not favoring the Republicans as strongly as, before this decision, as they were favored. There was this quote going around right after the Dobbs decision by some Republican strategist saying that this was a case of the dog that caught the car, I think implying that this sort of anti-abortion politics was more favorable to the right when it was just oppositional, but when they weren't actually in charge of the actual decision making, when they could just be against something and not actually changing laws and having actual effect on the world.
Yeah, now they got their way, and now it's coming back to bite them. I think they're in big trouble in November.
So it remains to be seen how potent a force the backlash is going to be, whether it's going to affect the Trumpite base enough or swing like the moderate Republicans away from these hard right anti-abortion candidates that are running in a lot of places. It definitely seems like the Democrats are running on this abortion issue in a lot of places. They're trying to tie Republican candidates directly to the anti-abortion rhetoric in order to peel Republican voters away from the Republican candidates.
Yeah, and the Republicans really overplayed their hand. They got the 6-3 supermajority, and so 5 decades of, well, of course, exceptions for rape and incest, and of course, we don't want to criminalize the woman who gets an abortion, and of course, all of that went out the window. And so a lot of people who have kind of like middle positions on abortion, they would be in favor of it with a lot of restrictions. Only, so therefore restricting abortion rights, but when it comes down to an absolute ban on abortion, no exceptions, criminalizing women, criminalizing the doctors, you play your hand like that, like the Republicans have done. They're going to get a lot of people who are going to say, and that seems to be the case in Kansas, even among Republican voters, no, we're not going to go that far with you. So they may have stepped out from the cliff, beyond the cliff.
The question is what are people supposed to do now? Because the Supreme Court has set up this precedent, or made this decision now where this is just something that is fought on a state-by-state basis and can be changed back and forth depending on the whims of the voters or politicians. So what is the women's movement doing now to save access to abortion?
Well, the women's movement scrambling to do everything, to fight in the states, state by state, as we must, to provide help to women who need abortions and need money to get out of state or whatever, and lobbying to try to change the state legislatures and to turn people out for the congressional elections to see if anything can be done by Congress. It's just they're all over the place doing things. But it's too little too late to stop the Supreme Court. The demonstrations following the decision didn't evoke any comment or apologies from the Supremes or the right wing. And going back to having each state control its own policy is like in the bad old days of Jim Crow and total racial discrimination, right? States' rights was always the cry of the reactionaries when it meant we can discriminate all we want against black people as long as there's no federal law prohibiting it. So all the advances in this area of the last 40 and more years now may be turned back on this principle of states' rights, which it's not discussed in the decision except in terms of, oh, this is always where the decision belongs. This is how you have democracy, by letting the states decide things because they're more in touch with their populations than is the federal government.
Yeah, and even before Jim Crow, that was like the lead up to the Civil War.
Yeah, that too. We got the right to secede, yeah.
State by state. Is this state going to be a slave state or a free state? And they kept fighting over, each state was a battleground until it just turned into a war.
Yeah, and they're in favor of states' rights, except when they're not. For instance, they got rid of New York State's ability to regulate open carry of handguns. And the governor here in New York State and the legislature have done things to try to mitigate that. But even that's no principle with those people. They're just blatant political hacks who are going to do what they're going to do and find whatever excuse.
Yeah, but let's look at what women are doing, okay, regardless of what the state legislatures are doing. Or not regardless, but they're trying to stop their state legislatures from passing these draconian laws like the ones that actually criminalize abortion or even driving someone to an abortion clinic. As Texas law now makes anyone involved able to be sued. So we're depending on good people being elected to the state government and being able to pass good laws. And that's just not an acceptable way to guarantee anybody rights. It has caused many women and young people to enter the races for state government. So I'm glad to see that. But we all know from all the gerrymandering and voter suppression that's been going on that attempt to create a legislature that actually reflects the people's will may not be possible, and it may not be able to stop the suppression of women and the loss of our rights. So I believe that what's needed are mass actions in the streets, and it's the only thing that's going to save abortion at all. I'm advocating women's marches, women's strikes, women's occupations, women's boycotts, etc. In short, we need to bring capitalism to a halt in order to force it to give up rule by these right-wing women haters. And I don't know the women's movement can't do this alone, but I think that's the direction it should be pursuing. And I think more and more people are talking about such things.
And when you say occupation, you mean occupy the Supreme Court?
No, they won't let you in. You're not going to get them to rescind their old decision. I mean general disruption of business as usual in every facet of this country's business. So certainly they should occupy the state legislatures. So if they're considering passing draconian laws. Anyway, I'm trying to illustrate the severity of the problem and the need for drastic action by women's groups and others.
The major reproductive rights organizations and women's organizations, are any of them thinking in these terms, or are they thinking more in terms of just legal actions and, in other words, court filings and stuff, and electoral politics?
I'm afraid I don't know. I certainly want to research that more thoroughly, but the ones you hear about are the more middle class women's groups, and they have their ways of doing things, and that's whose emails reach me. And they are talking largely about running candidates in state and federal elections who are pro women's rights and raising funds, setting up networks to help women in United States to get out and get an abortion elsewhere. Some of the states, like New York, are even creating funds to pay for women's trips themselves. The state pay themselves and put up the women in hotels and all that to make it possible. So there's that kind of activity going on, but I only see a few left wing radicals calling for the kind of action that I would call for.
Well, a couple years ago, when Biden was first elected, people were fantasizing about all these different things like packing the Supreme Court, impeaching justices for lying during their confirmation hearings, along with all these other pro-democracy measures. And I think a lot of the wind was taken out of the sail of those sort of aspirations when the voting protections measures that were being worked on by the Democrats were sabotaged by Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. But I wonder if any of that stuff is still on the agenda, or is that all just considered like out of the realm of possibility right now by the movement?
I don't know. I did hear one congressperson talk about, this shows that we need to expand the number of people in the court, which means, of course, to dilute the current court's powers by letting some liberals on who will outnumber them. So I don't think that's dead as an idea. I think, however, they're going to have to be enormous changes in Congress before that happens. At that point, Congress could also pass a federal law protecting the right to abortion. I don't know if it would survive the Supreme Court since they are so political, but it could at least try to codify Roe versus Wade. There were calls for that long ago, long before Dobbs. People were saying, hey, we need more protection. In case it goes, we need a federal law that guarantees the right. That could be done if anything could be done, if there could be a change in the Supreme Court. So we have to see what happens if we're able to get a more, quote, left leaning, close quote, Congress. In other words, if the Democrats come back with majorities or firmer majorities, will they have the nerve to do some things that badly need to be done?
There was a move recently among, the kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party. People were saying the reason that you guys are down in the polls is you've alienated your own constituencies, your own base. You promise them stuff and then you don't fight to the death to deliver. And so what you got to do is you got to say, if we get, let's say, a 52-seat Senate majority, in other words, you'd have 50 plus the Republican wing, Manchin and Sinema, but 50 would do it. We guarantee that if we get 52 seats, we're going to get rid of the filibuster for one time only and not have a filibuster. And by a 50 whatever plus Kamala Harris tie-break vote, we're going to have a federal law to protect abortion rights everywhere in the country. And so the idea was to try to get every sitting senator that you could to say, yeah, we're going to make this pledge, not their usual weasel worded stuff, but we pledge that if we get a 52 majority, we will vote to suspend the filibuster for this and vote in a national voting rights protection. I think that stalled. I think they got dozens of senators, but a lot of them still never wanted to come out and say publicly, yeah, I am committed and, I'm signing on the dotted line, that is what I commit myself to doing. And what that is basically telling people is it's still politics as usual. It's still, we can't count on you. We're supposed to trust you when we've been betrayed again and again and again. So I don't know where this is headed now, but I think that those efforts just stalled.
Well, people weren't prepared for Dobbs. Maybe it'll pick up again. Hopefully, when the Congress people go home on recess, or have they gone already? If they hold the town hall meetings and stuff, they'll be packed with women who will be throwing tomatoes at them for not having done something earlier to save the right to abortion. It could be a whole new ball game politically. It could be the demise of the Republican Party. Let's hope. But that will not, as I said, that won't automatically bring about abortion rights. I say bring about and not restore, because the laws we had in place for 50 years were very weak. The entire time the states and then churches had chipped away at the right to abortion. So there were so many restrictions and exceptions, and making it very, very difficult to function as an abortion clinic. I won't go into all that, but they were in bad shape before Dobbs. You remember it was, 20 years ago that right-wingers were killing abortion providers, shooting them dead in the clinics and in their places of worship and everything. And that's a fight that hasn't been resolved one way or another, frankly, by these legal decisions. We have to go much further.
Yeah, and I mean, even New York City. I mean, I remember Anne and I were active in clinic defense. I think this was the early 90s. People came from God knows where, and they were trying to harass and block access to women trying to get abortions right in the middle of Manhattan. So this is not just benighted South or rural versus urban. I mean, they were right in our face, and this was like 30 years ago.
Well, and they still are. There's still pickets every Saturday, counter pickets, because the right-wing anti-abortionists come and picket against abortion care. It's still going on.
But are they harassing and blocking access and doing all those kinds of things? Or are they just demonstrating?
Some laws were passed against their blocking access, so they can't get too close to the building or the people. But they're harassing them and they're yelling at them. And if the abortion rights people yell back, the cops intervene, always on the side of the anti-abortionists. It's really incredible. I mean, incredible for New York City, where you expect the cops to be a little more enlightened.
Of course, a lot of them are associated with the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Hey, we're going to return to this conversation in just a moment, but first, as we do in every episode, we're going to take just a few minutes to hear from Anne Jaclard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the organization which sponsors this podcast.
Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and today's many other social, political, and economic crises make this a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. In the U.S., we are faced with the threat of Trumpism triumphing, an all-out authoritarianism extinguishing our right to carry on these discussions. Yet at the same moment, the multiracial movement for Black lives has spread to every corner of the country and the world, launching a flood of activism and new ideas that deepen the concept of freedom. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses in which we do not merely assert but demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value, close quote. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not to socialism. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses who will form their own organization and whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Our ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, women, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. To this end, we open our website to the widest possible dialogue with people around the world. We intend to practice as well as espouse a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice, and as the way to assure the survival of Marxist-Humanism. Please join us.
So you were just mentioning activism that you've been engaged in, and over the past decades on this issue. So how does this tie into your Marxist-Humanism? Why have you spent so much time fighting for women's reproductive rights over the years?
Well, to me, there's no separation between being a Marxist-Humanist and being a feminist. The right to control her own body and reproduction is so fundamental to personhood that it's a condition for all other freedoms. You can't even talk about women's autonomous self-development without freeing her from the shackles of unwanted pregnancies followed by years of childcare. Every women's rights movement has encompassed this demand for reproductive freedom. So I think this is exactly what Marx and Marxist-Humanism are involved with. That is, we're centered on the aim and process of expanding human freedom. It's obvious to me there can be no diminution of a woman's control of her own body and still talk about expanding human freedom. Only when she has autonomous rights and control of her body can her mind be free to develop. One thinks of Marx's 1844 essay on private property and communism, where he says that a society's treatment of women is a reflection of men's treatment of women and men as well. One thinks about Marxist-Humanism's emphasis on the autonomy and self-development of mass movements for freedom, women as well as workers, youth, and minorities. So MHI has a long history, our history plus previous Marxist-Humanist history, of supporting mass freedom movements, and the women's movement no less than any others. What I wish I had done more of, however, was theorizing and discussing this relationship and leaving some kind of legacy for Marxist feminism that is been pretty much dead over the last few decades.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that comment that Marx made in his essay on private property and communism that Anne cited. I've always understood it kind of similarly to when people say you can understand the nature of a society by looking at how they treat their prisoners. And you can really understand, I guess, the nature of society by seeing position of women and the status of women. And I guess that's because prisoners and women traditionally have been those that are most vulnerable, easiest to abuse, and so forth. And so if you're going to see abuses and inhumanity, you're going to see it first among the treatment of prisoners, of women, and so forth. Is that how you understand it, Anne?
Yes, they are the most marginalized, the most powerless. Prisoners are absolutely powerless and subject to the whims of men, and the men have not always been kind, and the men are not necessarily interested in women's rights. Certainly the Trumpite types think that we should go back to make America great again, the days when women were barefoot and pregnant, stayed in the kitchen. That is still common in many cultures and countries. There's every country in the world that I know of has a fight going on for women's rights among grassroots women. So we have not achieved anything like a equitable society, nor are we likely to under capitalism, in my opinion.
It's clever marketing that the religious right has couched anti-abortion politics as a fight to save unborn babies, because it gives cover for what is really a extremely misogynistic view of the role of women in society. I mean, these people, most evangelicals have some degree of belief in the idea that women should be subordinate to men. If you listen to evangelicals talk about like the role of women in society, they have like extremely reactionary and old school views about women and men's roles. And this abortion thing is, I mean, that's what this is really about. It's not about like these abstract discussions on like when life begins or anything like that. It's about controlling women and their place in society.
Absolutely. And this all came about, this place we're at today all came about through unfortunate historical happenings which reflect the politics of the times. In other words, not only did the main laws against abortion come only at the end of the 1800s, along with them rendering medicine more professional and the doctors should be in control, not the women, and that sort of thing. But in particular for our times, it was until 40 years ago the Catholic Church that was interested in abortion. What political motivations they have, I won't speculate about, but for them it's a sin and there's no two ways about it and you never abort. But it was not widespread except among Catholics. And then the evangelical right-wing Christian, white Christian nationalist movement began to develop around the time of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And they joined forces with the Catholic Church. They were very smart, and together they accumulated quite a bit of power and influence. So that's just the history of how we got here. How we get out, I'm not sure. But, you know, it was ready-made for Trump. No, I was not religious in the least, but for him to satisfy a big section of his base, that is the white nationalist Christians, to take up this issue. And that's how we got here. Well, yes, the Dobbs decision does turn primarily and heavily on the rights of what they call unborn children, a fancy word for a fetus, and that's what they privilege over women's rights. They don't even talk about women's rights. It's not in the picture because, like the Catholic Church, if you're an absolutist about a fetus being a person, that's the end of the story. And you consider the personhood attaches at the moment of conception. There's no point at which abortion could be permitted. So that throws all of Roe versus Wade out, because Roe versus Wade carefully laid out, well, you can have abortions in the first trimester and sometimes in the second trimester, but never in the third, etc. That's all meaningless once you say life begins at conception, and any termination of it is murder. And that's what we're going back to if Alito gets his way. Well, he's gotten his way so far in terms of we've lost federal protection, but maybe we can yet save the right to abortion.
And maybe you could also talk to us a little bit about the course of the women's movement over the past 50 years or so.
Before Roe was handed down, we were fighting for federal laws to get passed and state laws to get passed, and some states did pass laws for the right to abortion. But at that time, the women's movement took a much more militant stance, or theoretically militant, about what it all meant. Our chant was always free abortion on demand. Now, the free part was important because there was less government-funded health care in those days, and it was expensive. So for it to be available to all women, it had to be free. And on demand means without restrictions, with no restrictions. And that was always our slogan, free abortion on demand. And it was always included, and still is always included, in any feminist group's agenda for what they're working on, because the problem's never gone away and because it's so fundamental. Absolutely imperative for women to have any control of their lives, that they have autonomy of their bodies. So that was what we chanted. And we also chanted, free our sisters, free ourselves, to indicate that the feminists were standing with all women, especially poor and black women. And then over the years, as the pro-abortion movement became more centered on large organizations, NGO types, professional types, who had the money and the organizations to control demonstrations and ads and movements and stuff, the demands narrowed. The main demand we heard at Clinic Defense most of the time, I'd say for the last 20 or 30 years, is just keep abortion legal. And that really riles me, keep abortion legal, because it's so limited, it's so narrow. It's like the most we can do is hope to keep Roe, which didn't work anyway. So I always objected. I said, no, we have to say more than keep it legal. We have to say free, on demand, and a few other things. But I did not prevail. Mostly the movement was engaged in non-disruptive defensive actions, like picket lines. There were massive demonstrations for women's rights over the years, but most feminists didn't believe that Roe could actually be overturned. So that was not the center point. And I recently heard some other feminists speaking about this, and I'm going to write some of that up in the article I'm working on this subject. But I'm not blaming the women for losing the right, but I'm saying we should learn the lesson that you can't go halfway, that you can't try to be polite, that you can't give over your movement to the professionals or the middle-class women. Much more radical stances and activity is required. I think now there will be some review and rethinking about history and strategy, that women are beginning to grapple with theoretical questions about women and society in terms of abortion rights and what the meaning of rights is and what revolutionary implications there are when you demand women's freedom.
Well, this has been a great conversation, so thank you, Anne, for coming on the podcast again to give us your insights.
Thanks so much for coming on, Anne, and talking with us about Dobbs and the fight back against it.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to see us mobilize the world in this fight, so let's get out there with a tape.
Hey, that's all the time we have for this episode of Radio Free Humanity. If you like the podcast, please do stop by Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org to listen to other episodes and to read more about these issues and others. As always, if you like the podcast, we encourage you to write to us, to comment and rate the podcast, and of course to share with all your friends and enemies.